Welcome to Dialogue. 2024 has been called the Voldemort of years by a US-based global political risk research and consulting firm with the top 3 global risks listed as the US versus itself, the Middle East on the brink, and a partitioned Ukraine. Will 2024 indeed be the Voldemort of years? Who or what is the source of today's global risks? And what are the predictions for China-EU relations in 2024? Joining me today in Munich is Professor Max Otte, German investor and entrepreneur. I'm Xu Qinduo. This is Dialogue. Welcome to Dialogue, Max, if I may call you. We'll start with Tucker Carlson's interview with Russian President Putin, and that was widely criticized in the Western world, I would say, in the US and also in this country, in this part of the land. And you disagree with this criticism. Tell us.
Of course. I mean, I've been following Tucker Carlson for a long time. He's a brave man. You don't have to agree with him. But of course, there have been some requests for interviews with Putin, but he declined those because he knew they would not be objective, so he couldn't speak his mind. So this is the first one he has accepted in a long time. And I think it's very important that we see how Mr. Putin thinks and what his ideas are. And Tucker Carlson basically asked him about his opinion on various things. I think Putin is a very rational actor. You don't have to agree with him. But that's, of course, the problem. Many policymakers in the West were concerned about to actually see the real Putin, let the real Putin be seen in the West, which is not the case and has not been the case for a long time. For maybe 1.5 decades, Putin has been demonized, and he was very much in favor of cooperation with Germany, with Europe, of a partnership. He offered his hand many times, and so now he's outlining his views, and that was not very well received by our policymakers.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, it all has to do with this Ukraine crisis. The reasons for the Ukraine crisis, for the conflict there, have different. Let's say there are different opinions in the governments, like in Western countries. This basically the view is very firm. That is Russia all to blame. Yes. The global South, actually, people see expansion of NATO that presented. This threat to national security of Russia. I mean there's justified security concerns probably on the side of Moscow. And what do you make of that? What are the factors that led to this crisis?
Well, one could talk a lot about this, but of course, one has to respect the country's legitimate interests, and indeed, it was offered. My dissertation was a part about this. This is 20 years ago, longer than 20 years ago, that NATO would not expand, and then it started expanding in various rounds of expansion. So at some point, Russia began viewing this as a serious threat, and of course, then we have the Euromaidan, which more and more facts are coming out. I mean, I do believe that Western services had a hand in this. I mean, there's some evidence, but what I know is that after Maidan, the IMF changed its statutes to...
That's 2014, right?
That's 2014. The IMF changed its statutes to lend money to Ukraine, and normally the IMF is not allowed to lend money to countries in war or civil war. And what I also know is that Ukraine started to bombard the people in the Donbas republics. What I know is that there was a very anti-Russian, also the Russian minority policies there. Nowadays, the Russian Orthodox religion is forbidden, opposition parties are forbidden. So every conflict has normally many roots, and there's causes for this. So I know Russia is not entirely to blame, and I actually share the opinion of my friend John Mearsheimer, who visited me last year, and he made a famous YouTube explanation in 2015 why Ukraine is the West's fault. So if I was to assign faults, it would be mostly with the West.
It was very popular, and Professor Mearsheimer, we did an interview with him too. Yeah. And of course now there are security agreements between Ukraine and Germany, between Ukraine and France and other European countries here. Of course, the US is debating about more aid to Ukraine. Do you think those aid will be say, play a role in deciding or shaping the fate of the crisis?
Well, the aid so far has prolonged the war. If there was one fault or one mistake, probably Russia did, was not to solve this earlier and more decisively. I think Putin had a lot of patience. That's if I put myself into his shoes, I mean, 2014, he could have gone much further. He didn't, because he trusted in the Minsk agreement. So all these weapons lead to a lot of deaths and a lot of suffering, and they won't change the outcome of the war, except if this goes on and on and on, certain parts in Western elites might be able to escalate the conflict, and that's a danger still. But by and large, Russia has won this war. I said so 1 year ago, so all this new.
You are not alone. Even today, including today, we just talk to people
in Germany.
Well respected.
But in Germany, there's not so many people who say this, because opinion here is very much in one direction. So, but right now, this aid will only prolong the war. And Ukraine, we know this is quite a corrupt country, and so a lot of this aid is going into pockets of different people and so on and so forth. But we'll see. I mean, Avdiivka, the day before yesterday, collapsed, which was an important fortress. So maybe now we get some developments, and that will force Ukraine to the negotiation table. Putin has said he's ready to negotiate again at the Tucker Carlson interview. So negotiations are what is needed.
That's true. And let's take a look at the global risks for 2024. This is from Eurasia Group, the consulting firm, saying that there are three top risks. One of them, of course, the US versus itself, and then Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine war, and then Israel versus Hamas there. And what's your opinion on that?
Well, I have to, let's say, make a little wider introduction to this, because this is one of those times when the world system completely changes. And that happens often every 100 to 80 years or something like this. And this has to do with a rising power and a declining power. China is a rising power. I wrote a lot about this in my book, World System.
Your book is 2019, right?
2019. And I wrote 2 chapters
of global system. Basically.
Yes, I wrote 2 chapters about the rise of China. I wrote about the declining middle class in the West. I wrote about the debt in the West, so I wrote about many things. Those all converge. But at the core of this, and I wrote this in my book, is China's rise and a relative decline in the United States. And that means the total international balance is shifting. There is a theory called hegemonic stability theory, that there's probably one leadership nation that sets the style for the world order, and that since 1945 has been the US, more or less. And then when the hegemon is declining, it might hold on to that power and become more aggressive in holding on to. And so that's the real basic conflict the world is going through. And everything we see, all of those conflicts are secondary conflicts that basically come from this basic structural drift in the world system. And so those 3 risks, the US versus itself, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, I mean, the US versus itself is one of the causes, and the other 2 are 2 of the consequences.
Of course.
And in my book I said this crisis is most likely to happen in the next few years, and we're in the middle of it. Maybe we're already close to the end of it. I expect it to end in 2 to 3 years. Terribly, well, we don't know how it will end, but it won't go on forever.
But it will last probably quite a long time. With the rise of not only China, but also like India or BRICS countries, many more countries. According to the India foreign minister, like 30 countries showing interest to join this BRICS group. Most of them, of course, emerging economies, developing world, the global south.
Right.
That shows, I mean, indeed, what people would call like a multilateral system or new kind of like a global order is emerging.
I made a prediction in my book in 19 on page 398, and I said we have 3 scenarios, and my most likely scenario was a new bipolar order, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever. So bipolar order centered around the US and an ever more dependent Europe. So Europe is being dominated more by the US, and another group centered around China, plus some, let's say, sub-centers like Russia, like maybe India, like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, that have somewhat, like Turkey, that have a somewhat autonomous policy, but basically we have a new bipolar order with a few independent actors.
Yeah, we will see, of course.
That's my prediction.
That's the interesting part of that. We know that one of your very famous book, what do you call it, like the coming crash?
Yes.
Or the crash will come.
Yes.
And you predicted this crash of the financial system globally, and 2 years ahead of what happened there. Tell us what prompted you, to draw that kind of conclusion, and you're right.
Yes, there were many things converging, but one, of course, was the growing indebtedness of Western nations. Even then, this is 16 years ago. So then what I really saw was that the housing bubble was unhealthy and was about to collapse. And Fortune, the US magazine Fortune in 2005 ran an article about the coming collapse of the housing market in the US, the subprime. So I put the pieces together and said, okay, we're at the end of a large economic cycle, and this will lead to a big crash, and this will lead maybe to economic reform and so on. What I didn't realize was that Western states got involved ever more in the economy in the wrong direction, more directed economy, more of the same, so more debt, more government intervention to keep this unhealthy path going. So that was a part I didn't predict.
Oh, so okay, mystics remain there, remain unresolved. Well, let's take a look at this, of course, economic situation, and starting from this country, for example, German economy. Last year, 2023, there's a shrinkage, what do you call recession maybe, and for this year, the prediction is like 0.9%, below 1%. So I would say there's a growth, but very slow. Yes. Why it's so slow? What's wrong with the economy?
Well, I mean, this country, and it bleeds my heart as a German. I have my German things here.
You're a patriot.
So I am, although I'm also a US citizen, but it bleeds my heart what's happening to this country. It's probably the most stupid policy any government can possibly conceive for the economy, I mean, worldwide, and for a long time. It's suicidal. I mean,
like what policies? Yeah,
we started with the energy Wende, the Energiewende, the turnaround in energy. So no fossil fuels, no nuclear power. And Germany had the best nuclear power plants in the world, and we had fantastic.
Shutting down.
Yeah, we just shut them down. We shut down. We let Nord Stream 2 be shut down by some act of sabotage. We don't investigate it.
It was bombed. Yeah.
So we don't investigate. We don't want to know who did it. I'm fairly convinced that the US was in the know and that the US did it, and many people share this view, but the government is not interested in thinking about it. Then we have our education system is declining, so we have really stupid policies. High energy, we don't really value science that much. I mean, my economist I do respect a lot is Friedrich List, who was a great economist in the first half of the 19th century. He said, it's not free trade. I mean, you need trade, obviously. It's not all about class struggle, that's Marx. I mean, there's different, of course, interpretations, but it's about the system of productive forces. Germany doesn't have many natural resources. It has lots of people. It doesn't have much land. So what did we have? We had people. We could educate the people. We could be number one in science. We could have a cooperative system of labor and business and state. So not this antagonistic view that is, let's say, Anglo-Saxon or free trade theory, everybody against everybody. But it's more a cooperative model, which values science, education, the rule of law, all these things. And all of this is, unfortunately, is being dismantled, and it's being dismantled quickly. We have somewhat of a cultural revolution with all the gender topics and all that basically diverts attention from the important topics. Science, technology, stability, rule of law, all of these things are being neglected. So it's really sad to watch.
And also the value-based foreign policy making. I want to have your views on that. You know, of course, that's somehow it's like you have different ideology, you have different political system. I tend not to do business with you, and so the de-risking, etc.
Value-based foreign policy is the road to hell. Because, I mean, what Europe learned after 1648, the 30 Years' War, when Catholics fought about Protestants for 30 years, whose religion is right. And after that we said, no, his religion is his religion, our religion is our religion, we respect that, we trade, we talk to each other, but we respect each other. And that's the basis of a sound international order. I mean, you respect another country's values or system, and you don't interfere in domestic affairs. And this was the basic of a sound international order for a long time. And now this, of course, is all being put aside for the sake of a more ideological approach. And it's clear why that ideological approach is happening, because indeed the US is the declining hegemon. It wants to mobilize forces, it wants to maintain its position, and it recruits, let's say, ideological motives and its own superior values. I just looked this up today. I mean, the number of prisoners in the US per 100,000 is about 500, which is extremely high. It's the highest in the civilized world by far. The number in Russia is 300, which is still very high. The number in Germany is 68. So when you talk about prisoners and the society and homicides and all this, I mean, you could talk about anything when you go into a value-based order. No, you should talk about national interests, you should talk about the states, you should respect states as entities that have their own system and try to get along.
Well, if I may be frank, I think, you know, obviously you see a heavy influence of US in this country in terms of this ideological thinking, in terms of the US you know, whatever you call it, containment of China, you know, to slow down the Chinese development, and then somehow they recruit like European countries to join them against China. You know, there's this, of course, this relationship. You have to find a balance, or kind of being difficult, you know, to conduct between Germany and China. Well, speak of that, Chancellor Olaf Scholz is to visit China in April.
Right.
So, and what's your expectation?
For a long time, China and Germany have been trading partners. The relationship has shifted, but that's okay. That's okay. I mean, it's dynamic in relationships, and there was more of a balance in former times. But let's say the U.S. Institutions are being instrumentalized to block Chinese foreign investment in Germany, but we have a lot of dominance in foreign investment by the U.S. in Germany. So the German economy and policy making has a lot of US influence. It's being dominated. BlackRock is the largest shareholder in our DAX 30 companies. So, I mean, talk about foreign influence. The US influence in Germany is extreme. So if Scholz comes and if he manages to maintain some kind of decent approach and relationships, that's all I hope for, and I'd be happy if he does that.
Well, speak of the US influence, I think in previous interview you said Germany has lost its strategic autonomy and become a quote-unquote colony of the US.
Yes.
Do you still think so?
Oh, it's even more so. I mean, the Ukraine war has really made Germany even more dependent on the US, totally dependent, I would say. The cutoff from Russian gas, the ideological domination, but of course also the big tech, high tech dominations. I know that a few years ago, large Chinese high-tech company was excluded from various deals, but of course the US high-tech companies are completely dominating the German discussion. And then Microsoft has now announced to remove certain unwanted content from Windows and so on and so forth. So there's a huge influence. And the only party that questions this is the AfD, which is pretty strong right now. It's the second strongest party, but all the other parties don't want to cooperate with the only party that roots, let's say, for German independence or autonomy and so on. And that's why the AfD is being demonized. But indeed, Germany right now is totally dependent on the US influence.
Yeah, we see this the recent report of the U.S. measures against Volkswagen, the Chinese production and export their car to the U.S. the customs.
If I may, this colonization, this dependence is in fact the consequence of a legal revolution. The U.S. applies its own laws, which should only govern the U.S. internationally. So if somebody does business with the U.S., they use that to blackmail that company. I mean, if it then does business with China and they say, oh, this is not in accordance with the U.S. policies, that third-party company gets problems. And so that's very, very imperialistic in some ways.
Yes, and also in a way they have influenced their thinking here to the point of pursuing a policy of de-risking and also calling China as a systematic rebel, things like that. But still, as you said, we have trade. China remains the largest trading partner of Germany for consecutive 80 years, if I'm right. So there's the question that people from China would ask, de-risking policy that will obviously affect trade to some extent.
Yes.
It's really about to what extent, investment from this country to China that will be under scrutiny.
Yes.
Chinese investment will also be taking a close look, things like that. Do we have any clear idea, to what degree that will affect relationship?
Yes, what you call de-risking, I 18 years ago in Der Crash kommt called deglobalization. So it is normal for the international systems to have periods of globalization and also of deglobalization. When I called it out 18 years ago, nobody believed it. But now we're in the process of deglobalization, and de-risking is just another name put on it. So I would be happy, I expect that deglobalization to continue in line with the bipolar world I see. One center around China, one around the US, a basically dependent Europe on the US. So that's the West, and the West has this kind of wagon circle mentality. So they draw a circle around themselves and let's say isolate themselves more. So we see how far this goes. I'm afraid it will continue, but I hope it won't go too far and too fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the Munich Security Conference, if you read their report, the report says, without the participation of the global South, there won't be international security. It seems to me they remain open to welcome the participation of the global South. So is that the case? And they did mention that there's a possibility, or there's the worst scenario could be like a lose-lose situation.
Well, but unfortunately, of course, the worst scenario is also a possible scenario. Let's not hope it turns out to be that case. But now, of course, at those conferences, you make statements, let's say, for potential allies. So he says, yes, the global South should be included and so on and so forth. But the way I see it right now, the West is really losing trust. There's the loss of trust in the dollar. There is this conflict in Gaza, which has cost, of course, the US and Israel and the supporters a lot of credibility in the South and in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia is going its own course, breaking away to some extent from the US. Iran is manifesting itself. So I think that's more lip service right now. Right now, this focus is very much on the West and on, let's say, the conflict with Russia. And what I really also see with great worries is that there's now 30 extraterritorial US bases in Norway, and the Norwegians like this, but it's an extension of this confrontational attitude towards Russia, control of the Arctic, and so on and so forth. So in reality, I think the West is on a pretty confrontational course.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's also a concern on the side of the EU or European countries? The concern is okay, there's a loss of cheap Russian gas and energy, and now they are trying to de-risk from China, for example, the China market. And also there's a loss of credibility from the global South. When the West often cite this rules-based international order.
Right.
But seems to me like there's a set of rules when it comes to Ukraine crisis, but it's different from Gaza crisis.
Completely different, quite hypocritical. So, I mean, it's being used as it fits. And let's put it this way, if you go on a confrontational course and you encircle yourself, if sound policy and the rule of reason, if you deviate from that, and if you have a suicidal policy or a confrontational or sometimes for Europe very stupid policy, you have to replace reason with ideology to continue on that rather unsound course. And that's what we're seeing, a pretty big ideologization of our countries, which I deeply deplore. I think reason should prevail, but right now we see a lot of unreason.
And let's talk something personal. You know, you were a long-time CDU member, and then of course you had to leave the party and run in 2022 the German presidential election as a candidate of the AfD. For those who are not familiar with this politics in this country, AfD is reported as or is described as the right-wing party, but it's very popular.
Yes,
its approval rating is like a second, right?
Yes.
So tell us, why did you take that move in 2022? Like, it seems it cost you politically and academically.
Of course, I left my professorship position, my tenured position 5 years ago because there was just too much to do. I'm an entrepreneur and I write books and so on, so I couldn't stay on at the university. So I left it voluntarily. I said, I quit this because I have too much to do. But the AfD is being demonized. All the other parties are pretty much against it, but it's a party of reason. It's a patriotic party. It wants good relations with Russia. It wants to put Germany's interests first, which I think is the right thing to do within reason. I mean, with that candidacy, I wanted to make a sign for the CDU to talk to the AfD to be more open, and I got second most votes. And it certainly created a lot of attention. But of course, financially, it was not good for me. And also, of course, German media don't talk to me that much anymore. I was a lot in German media before, but that was worth it. It was a sign that we should not exclude AfD from the dialogue. We should include it in the dialogue.
Finally, what's your outlook of the world in 2024 and beyond?
Yes, as I said before, we are in this process of completely changing the world system. And this has started in some ways in 9/11, so 2001, but it has accelerated since the financial crisis, and we had the migration crisis in the West, then COVID, then the Ukraine war broke out, and then Gaza, so it's going ever quicker. So we'll have a decision where this will turn in about 2 to 3 years. It won't go on forever. There's a culmination point, and we're driving towards that culmination point. It can be, if unreason prevails, it can be catastrophic, but let's hope we'll find a new, more or less bipolar, stable order and a faint hope, which I want to utter at the end of this interview. Let's hope that Germany and Europe will find their own way again.
Well, thank you, Professor Otte.
My pleasure.
Thank you for talking to us.